Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. I'm your host Mike, and on this week's episode, we bring you Krenko Mob Boss at a $100 budget. Krenko is 2, a red and a red for a legendary creature Goblin Warrior. It has tap, create X 1/1 red Goblin creature tokens, where X is the number of goblins you control. All prices in this video are powered by TCGPlayer. If you guys are going to be shopping on TCGPlayer, it would mean the world to me if you guys would use my affiliate link, which I'll put up on the screen right now, and it will also be in the show notes down below. It doesn't cost you anything, but it does help the channel out quite a bit if you use that affiliate link. So this Krenko deck is a Goblin tribal deck. We're going to focus on getting a bunch of low CMC goblins onto the battlefield the first couple of turns before we get Krenko onto the battlefield to get things really going. With Krenko, we'll be able to put a ton of tokens onto the battlefield for all the goblins that we control. And then we do have a lot of cards that are able to pump our tokens up and make them a lot bigger, either through Goblin Lords that we have in the deck or through other tribal enchantments that are going to grow our creatures by how many goblin creatures we have on the battlefield, or by pumping red creatures up in general. And then we have a lot of spells that deal extra damage to our opponents whenever we do stuff like attack, whenever a creature enters the battlefield, or whenever a creature dies. So we'll be able to close out the game very quickly if we're able to get going and get Krenko making a lot of tokens with some of those cards on the battlefield. Next up, let's talk about the stats of this deck. So in this deck, we have 6 ramp cards, which is a little light, but we are playing a deck with a low converted mana cost average. And then we have 7 card draw spells. Card draw is really hard to come by in a mono red deck. You have to rely mostly on cards that help you filter and loot, and then artifacts as your card draw spells, but there's not a lot of really great artifact cards that help you draw. Then we have 32 goblins. Since this is a tribal goblin deck and Krenko relies so heavily on how many goblins you have on the battlefield, we did ensure that we had a critical mass of goblins in this deck. There's 8 spells that help you pump your creatures up, give them additional power or toughness, and then we have 6 extra damage spells that are going to deal damage when your creatures enter the battlefield, when your creatures die, or when your creatures attack. And then we do have 34 lands in this deck, which is a little light for a commander deck, but like I said, the converted mana cost of this deck is so low that you don't need a whole lot of lands in here. Let's start with this deck type by talking about some of the ramp that we have in this deck. So first up, we have Soul Ring. It taps to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. Prismatic Lens taps to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. It's good for filtering mana, but in a monocolor deck, we don't really need that. Mind Stone taps for 1 colorless mana, and then you can pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice it to draw a card. Then we have Star Compass. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap to add a mana of any one color from a basic land you control could produce. And then we have Heraldic Banner. It's a newer one out of Throne of Eldraine. When it enters the battlefield, choose a color. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+0, and you can add 1 mana of the chosen color to your mana pool. This is a really nice mana rock because it's going to pump all your 1/1 goblins up and make them into 2/1s, so you'll be able to get some additional damage in on your opponents. Next up, let's go over some of the draw that we have in this deck. Now, we are playing mono red, so there's not a whole lot of draw that we can put in here. There are a few cards that will help us dig deeper throughout our deck to find some of the important pieces that we need. So first up, we have Faithless Looting. It's a sorcery and lets us draw 2 cards and then discards 2 cards. And the nice thing about this card is it also has flashback for 2 and a red, so you can cast this card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, and then you exile it. Then we have Cathartic Reunion. It's a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, discard 2 cards, and then you draw 3 cards. Thrill of Possibility is similar. It's an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card, then you draw 2 cards. Next up, we have Skull Clamp. It's a 1 mana artifact. Equipped creature gets +1/-1 whenever equipped creature dies. Draw 2 cards, and it has Equip for 1. This is one of the best card draw spells for a token deck that you can get in this game. Hazard's Monument's a nice card. It's a legendary artifact. Red creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So this lets you loot, and it also reduces the casting cost of all of your red spells, which is great in this deck. Outpost Siege is a great card in a mono red deck. It's an enchantment. As it enters the battlefield, choose cons or dragons. Cons, at the beginning of your upkeep, exile a top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. And dragons, whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege deals 1 damage to any target. Most of the time, we are going to play this for its con side because you do want that extra card advantage because it's so hard to come by in red. But that dragon's side is also really nice since you're playing a token strategy and you can put a lot of tokens onto the board. When they do leave the battlefield, it can deal a lot of damage to your opponents. So sometimes you may want to play it for dragons as well. Then we have arguably one of the best cards in this deck, and one that I find I really like in this deck, and it's Slate of Ancestry. It's an artifact, and you can pay 4 and tap it, discard your hand, draw a card for each creature you control. Since you're going to make so many creatures in a Krenko deck, this will draw you a ton of cards, and discarding your hand isn't really a downside, because a lot of times when you do play this card and you go to crack it, you are empty-handed anyway, because card draw is so hard to come by in a mono red deck. Next up, we have a couple of token generators in this deck. Now, Krenko does make a lot of tokens himself, but before we get Krenko onto the battlefield, we do want to have a couple other goblins on there. It's going to go a lot quicker with your Krenko if you do have goblins on the battlefield when you get him down and start tapping him. So first up, we have Dragon Fodder and Krenko's Command. They're both sorceries, and they both put 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens onto the battlefield. Then we have Hordling Outburst. It's a sorcery to create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and then Goblin War Party is similar. It's going to create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, or creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain haste. You can pay it in Twine to get both of those abilities as well. These are all really great cards to get some tokens onto the battlefield before you get your Krenko out, and then you can start going to the races and putting a lot of tokens on the battlefield with Krenko. Next up, let's get into the goblins that we have in this deck, and we do have quite a few. We've got over 30 goblins in this deck, and goblins are the most important part of this deck because this is a tribal goblin deck. Now, we want to focus on goblins that we can get down before Krenko hits the battlefield, because we want to have a critical mass of goblins when we play Krenko and we're able to tap him to get some more goblins onto the battlefield. And we do want ones that give us some additional value, so we're not just going to put any old random 1 mana goblin in the deck. We want to try to get something else out of it. So first up, we have Foundry Street Denizen. Whenever another red creature enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Goblin Sledder is a sacrifice outlet. Target creature gets +1/+1 and if you sacrifice a goblin. And then Skirk Prospector allows you to sacrifice a goblin to add a red mana to your mana pool. Since you are making so many tokens, you can sack them to get some additional mana, and then you're able to kind of go off with this card. It also provides a sack outlet with something like Boggart Shenanigans that we have in this deck, or other cards. Whenever your creature dies, it deals 1 damage to your opponent. Then we have Goblin Soothsayer, Goblin Motivator, and Goblet Churagon. They're all 1 mana goblins that don't have really relevant abilities. Churagon is probably the best one. It lets you sack a goblin to regenerate a creature, so that gives you a way of having a sacrifice outlet and also protecting your more powerful goblins like Krenko. Then we have Maw Raider, sack a goblin, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Fanatical Firebrand is a 1/1 goblin that has haste, and you can tap it and sack it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Goblin Bushwhacker is one of the better goblins at 1 mana. It has Kicker for a red. Whenever it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. You can put a bunch of goblins onto the battlefield and then kick a Bushwhacker to give them all haste. Then we have Goblin Lookout, sack a goblin, all goblins get +2/+0 until end of turn. Instigator comes with a 1/1 goblin creature token, and so does Mog War Marshal. It also has Echo on it as well. Goblin Crater Maker has a sacrifice ability on it to deal 2 damage to target creature or to destroy a target colorless non-land permanent. Goblin War Driver has Battle Cry. Whenever it attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0. And then Goblin Diplomats is an interesting one. You can tap it to each creature attacks this turn if able. So you can make one of your opponents have to attack you, and then that will open up a lane so where you'll be able to swing in with all of your goblins. Goblin Pile Driver is one of the more powerful ones. It has protection from blue, and whenever it attacks, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking goblin. Warren Instigator is a goblin with double strike, and whenever it deals damage to an opponent, you may put a goblin creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. The cool thing about this is with the double strike, if it does connect with your opponent, you'll be able to put 2 goblins onto the battlefield with this card. Dark Dweller Oracle is a newer one out of M19. Sack a creature, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. It's a really good card at getting you some card advantage, which we desperately need in a mono red deck. Then we have Conspicuous Snoop. It's a new one out of M21. Play with the top card of your library revealed. You may cast goblin spells from the top of your library. As long as the top card of your library is a goblin card, Conspicuous Snoop has all activated abilities of that card. Goblin Recruiter and Goblin Matron both help us find goblins, which makes them very powerful in our deck to find some of our more higher end goblins that we're looking for. Goblin War Chief reduces the cost of all of your goblins, and it also gives them a very important haste, which is something that we want in this deck. Goblin Chieftain is similar. It gives all your goblins haste as well, and it also gives them +1/+1. Goblin King gives all your goblins +1/+1, and they also have Mountain Walk as well. Next up, we have Reckless Bushwhacker. It has Surge. You can cast a spell for its Surge cost if you or a teammate has cast another spell this turn. It also has Haste. When it enters the battlefield, if its Surge cost was paid, other creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain Haste until end of turn. Goblin Chain Whirler is 3 red mana for a creature with first strike. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. Goblin Rabblemaster is a creature that other goblin creatures you control attack each turn if able. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token with haste. Whenever it attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking goblin. Then we have Krenko Tin Street Kingpin, a newer one out of War of the Spark. Whenever it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it, then create a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to its power. Pashalisk Mons is a creature. Whenever it or another goblin you control dies, it deals 1 damage to any target, and then you can sacrifice a goblin to create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. So this is not only a sacrifice outlet, but it also helps deal damage whenever your creatures die. So it does give you some built-in Wrath protection. Goblin Ringleader is another card that's going to help us find goblins off the top of our library. Goblin Trashmaster is another lord that gives all of our goblins +1/+1, and then you can sack a goblin to destroy target artifact. And then Siege Gang Commander is our most expensive goblin in the deck. It comes in with 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and you can sack a goblin for it to deal 2 damage to any target for paying 1 in a red. Next up, let's go over some of the cards that are going to pump our goblins up and or deal some additional damage when they enter the battlefield or die. So first up, we have Quest for the Goblin Lord. It's a 1 mana enchantment. Whenever a goblin enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a quest counter on Quest for the Goblin Lord. As long as Quest for the Goblin Lord has 5 or more quest counters on it, creatures you control get +2/+0. This is going to give your little goblin tokens a huge boost when you go to attack your opponents. They're going to turn them into formidable threats, and that is something that we need in this deck, especially to get through blockers that your opponents may have. Next up, we have Throne of the God Pharaoh. It's a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. Now it's going to double up. If you go to attack your opponents with your creatures, not only are you going to deal combat damage, but at the end of your turn, you're also going to deal a ton of damage with Throne of the God Pharaoh as well. And the really nice part about this card is it deals to each opponent, not just the opponent that you attacked or that you have to choose. So this will deal quite a bit of damage to your opponents. Next up, we have Impact Tremors. It's an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, Impact Tremors deals 1 damage to each opponent. Again, this deals it to all opponents, making this a really great card to include in your deck. Next up, we have Shared Animosity, and this is a card that has gone down in price since it was just reprinted in Commander 2020. So if you don't have one of these, I would go ahead and pick one up quickly because these have gone up in price in the past, and it probably will again. So it's an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking creature that shares a type with it. So if you attack with 5 goblins, your goblins are going to be 6 1s because it's going to get +5/+0. So it's going to make your goblins very, very large when you go to attack with this card on the battlefield. Icon of Ancestry is an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. In this deck, we are going to choose goblins. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1, which is a really nice boost, and then you can pay 3 and tap it. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card of the chosen type from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Again, card draw is really hard to come by in a mono red deck. Something like Icon of Ancestry is going to be phenomenal in this deck because you're going to be able to get goblins off the top of your library. Ogre Battle Driver is a creature that whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature gets +2/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. So not only is this going to give your goblins haste, which is something that we desperately need in this deck, but it's also going to pump them up too, which is really nice. Next up, we have Hellrider. It's a creature with haste. Whenever a creature you control attacks, Hellrider deals 1 damage to defending player. So this is going to let you double up on some damage when you go to attack your opponents and get in some additional damage that we need to get. Since we are playing more of an aggro strategy, we want to close out that game as quickly as possible. And then last but not least, we do have Torbrain, Thane of Red Fell. This is a really powerful card out of Throne of Eldraine. If a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2 instead. All of your 1/1 goblins are going to hit for 3 instead of hitting for 1. This is a powerful card. and one that's great to include in this deck for only $1. Next up, we have a couple of utility cards that don't really fit anywhere else, so I'll talk about them here. First up, we have Mob Justice. It's a sorcery. Mob Justice deals 1 damage to target player for each creature you control. This can provide you another way of winning the game if your opponents have a way of stopping you from attacking. You can kill one of your opponents if you have enough goblins on the battlefield with this card. Next up, we have Byforce. It's a sorcery to destroy X target artifacts. Getting rid of artifacts is something that red is good at doing, and we do want to have some ways of interacting with our opponents, and this is a great card at doing that. Next up, we have Fervor. It's an enchantment, and it just says plainly, creatures you control have haste. Haste is really important in this deck because we do want to get in with our goblins as quickly as we can, and not only that, we do want to be able to tap Krenko the turn he comes down to get value and get a lot of goblins onto the battlefield as quickly as possible. Next up, we have a couple of cards that fit into the wincon territory. So first up, we have Goblin Bombardment. It's an enchantment that you can sacrifice a creature. Goblin Bombardment deals 1 damage to target creature or player. A card that goes really great with Goblin Bombardment is Boggart Shenanigans. It's a tribal enchantment. Whenever another goblin you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may have it deal 1 damage to target player. So this will make all of your goblins deal 2 damage whenever they die, and if your opponents go to board wipe, you can sack them all to Goblin Bombardment, and if you have Boggart Shenanigans, you also get some additional value off of it as well. Probably the most powerful card in this deck, other than Krenko, is Perforos, God of the Forge. Now, it is pretty expensive at about $17, but since goblins are pretty cheap, we were able to include it in this deck and still be under the $100 budget that we were looking for. Perforos is a legendary enchantment creature god that's indestructible. As long as your devotion to red is less than 5, it's not a creature. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Perforos deals 2 damage to each opponent. You can pay 2 in a red, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. This is going to deal a ton of damage to our opponents. It deals it to all opponents. Whenever we tap Krenko to put goblins onto the battlefield, it's going to deal a ton of damage. It's going to put your opponents in a really tough spot. In addition, if you want to go to attack your opponents, Perforos will help pump your creatures up as well. So he's a very powerful card in this deck, and like I said, probably one of the more powerful ones in here. Thank you so much for watching our video today. If you like this video and you want to see more Budget Commander content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can also check us out on patreon.com/budgetedh. There's a bunch of different tiers and ways to interact with us outside of YouTube. We'll see you guys next time.